As a pessimist, in spite of the fact that I've seen amazing things today in terms of the generation of data, in terms of identifying populations, in terms of using electronic databases, I would argue that there's no free lunch. You still have to tame the data, and that takes time, money, and fortitude. As an optimist, I would say that it is worth looking at proactive new models to facilitate value assignment. And as a caveat, I would say before you can actually address the economics of value, you actually have to have some science there. And that we as a laboratory community perhaps haven't done as good a job at making the case that we can. The pessimist in me would win out, except I don't forget the adage that it was actually the turtle that won the race. So I'm going to turn this over now to Rena.
I work for Xiphon, which is a revenue cycle management company specifically for the laboratory industry. And we have almost 60% of all the molecular claims that are submitted go through the Xiphon system. So we have quite a bit of what we call collective intelligence in this arena. And one of my main role there is to work with early stage molecular companies from what I call the twinkle in the eye concept all the way through various stages of commercialization. So needless to say, value, pricing are absolutely critical to this process. And the laboratory industry is quite unique in the sense that we are not captains of our own destiny when it comes to pricing and value, like pharma, like device. We are held captive to a coding and pricing system that dates back to, I believe, 1984. So as we talk about value, I think one thing that we really have to keep in mind is that, and I hate to be the 2,000-pound gorilla in the room, but this science is driven by dollars, and dollars are generated by investors. And the investment community is extremely skittish right now about this space because of all the uncertainty. We right now, when people come to us and want some assistance with how do we price our test, what do we look at? We look at what others are billing for the test, what payers are allowing, usually on a code basis, what like tests are being reimbursed, and even United Healthcare, the Ingenix division, will publish on an annual basis the 50th and 75th percentile of what they're seeing for billed claims. So is that the value of where the test should be? Heard another interesting interpretation of what value is from a quite high-level Aetna executive last month. And in his role, he works a lot with employers that have self-insured plans. And they say that the questions that they ask themselves as far as value is, would the average person making $50,000 a year find this test valuable enough? We talked about some, personal utility today, to pay for it out of pocket. And another way that employers will look at it is for every $1 million of associated costs with bringing on a new entity to their coverage policies, they're looking at 15 to 20 jobs. So that's another perspective on what value is. And along the lines of lack of clarity, we have these new coding initiatives from the AMA, and we don't even know at this point which fee schedule they're going to be on, whether they're on the clinical lab fee schedule or the physician's fee schedule, have tremendous pricing implications, so we don't know if there's going to be a return on our investment. I think that another unique thing about our business is that, for the most part, I think providers are really passionate about providing better health care and doing the right things for patients, but we are also dependent on the dollars. We're running businesses. We need the dollars to help make these things happen. So just like to conclude by saying that right now I think we have far more questions than we do answers. We've heard a lot about sequencing today. The AMA and these new coding initiatives has not even addressed next-gen sequencing, although, as we've heard today and we've known even before we came into this room, it is here, it is real. So are these initiatives going to be obsolete before they even are implemented next year?
Patrick.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Patrick Terry. I work for a management consulting group that consults for hundreds of biotech and diagnostic and therapeutics companies in the personalized medicine space and how to navigate the nuances and this evidence landscape and these requirements and how do you define value. We talked about clinical utility and health economics. Steve and I were talking before the session started that I come from a perspective that there's already enough spend in healthcare that we don't need to increase spending. We need to optimize utilization in a much more effective way. But defining that value creation, capturing it, and transferring it to the entity that actually delivering that value is the difficulty here. Being one of the co-founders of Genomic Health, that business model was a complete contortion ultimately to be successful and sustainable with delivering a multi-gene panel in a complex setting of cancer testing, as Robert referred to, as these new diagnostics are extremely challenging and do not map well to an IVD kit manufacturer type of business model. And since leaving Genomic Health, trying to execute alternative business strategies to reach these thresholds of evidence and understanding what are the minimal requirements necessary to be successful beyond just regulatory sufficiency, about defining value, defining utility, capturing and defining offsets in the clinical marketplace so the decision makers, the gatekeepers, the users, and the payers all can make assessments of that evidence and make determinations whether it's appropriate use, meaningful benefit, and so on and so forth. So we're ended up talking about really squishy terms like constellation of value and walking through medical unmet needs, clinical circumstances, the nuances of a test, a technology, a clinical pathway, the trajectory of patient care, the overall spend, and having some type of integrity or clinical study that actually shows influence. And that was what was referred to. There was a tremendous resistance from the traditional diagnostic community to ever demonstrate clinical utility because you're so far removed from all of the biases, both physician and patient biases, clinical decision makings, other different influencers on the care pathway beyond the diagnostic. So to put that evidence burden on a diagnostic was seeming unreasonable. But I think more and more corporations now are embracing this RX-like clinical study design, real-world clinical studies, unique business solutions that are more business-to-business solutions about reimbursement. To Rena's point, there's so much uncertainty around the clinical lab fee schedule and everything being fixed to a time in motion, cost-plus business model, which is actually anchored the diagnostic industry to a floor that ultimately the evidence requirements from the external community is completely unreasonable now for what you can return. There's again and again market models that we do for companies that have interesting science, to Steve's point, that can meet a predicate standard, that can go through a PMA, and we show them that there is actually 12 to 18 years until you actually see a break even with your investment. And ultimately, the life cycle for a diagnostic will, and the ability to protect that investment or that opportunity is maybe a 3 to 5 year period. So ultimately, this becomes a real dilemma and a thorny, complex issue. Certainly, companion diagnostics and therapeutic linkages and other revenue models for some of these technologies is a much more easily executable business solution. There's lots of experiments. I've been involved with lots of successful companies, but now I'm at the helm of driving 2 companies through the process of bankruptcy. So it has not been all sun and flowers in this environment. There's extremely technical and logistical challenges here that were alluded to, and evidence is certainly one of them. But there's lots of examples now that of what works and what hasn't worked, what can be reduced to practice and what can't. But when that gets resolved, then we have ongoing uncertainties now in the regulatory arena and reimbursement arena that is I think, the community is, the investment community and risk capital is somewhat perseverating on now that we're going to wait till the dust settles and see what happens. So I think we're going to somewhat be captured by the hope and the promise of these technologies, but the lack of real fruit on the vine here and examples of stellar successes and alleviation of real human burden of disease because of these economic challenges.
Thank you. Brian.
Thank you, and thank you, Sharon, for having me at this conference and at this panel. It's been a wonderful discussion. I'd like to just make a few high-level points and observations and then really open it up to the panel and for questions. I think we've heard throughout the morning and from the panelists here the well-known challenges for reimbursement for new molecular diagnostics. And what we want to try to talk about and look at are what are potential solutions and long-term frameworks that we can put together to have a much more predictable and transparent pricing arena. So with that, I'd like to just make 2 or 3 observations. We've heard a lot about value-based payment, and it's commonly referred to in the literature and policy circles. Last week, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial by Sam Waxall about value-based payment for new targeted therapies, but there's been surprisingly little out there in terms of real-world practice, and that's one thing I'd like to try to drill down on with the panel and people here. It's a very appealing concept, but it's proved to be very challenging. There are a few examples of innovators entering into risk-sharing agreements with commercial payers where they would set payment based on reaching certain metrics, but setting those up practically has been very challenging. Coming up with what the metrics are, what the different outcome measurements will be, has been very difficult, and you don't see too many successful versions of that. So is that the model that people would want to build on towards a value-based payment, or is there another model out there that we can look to that is really going to be more successful and more widely used? The second point, to pick up on what Rena talked about and what Dr. Jeter and others may talk about, we're going to be faced with this in the spring and the summer as Medicare starts to look at how to price the new molecular pathology codes, and that will be a huge indication of how Medicare will move forward with pricing new technologies, and are there ways to work within the current regulations to expand and enhance the different processes that Dr. Jeter and CMS has under the gap fill process, where you can really look at what is the value of a test, what are other payers paying, what does it cost to not only perform the test but to develop it? Is that something that we can build upon to create a bigger solution? And then I guess the final point would be, given the limitations of the current system we're working within, really are we talking about coming up with a new solution or framework that would really look much more at how the market is valuing these tests and what other payers and providers are paying for tests, and use that as some type of baseline to come up with a market-based reimbursement system the way you've seen developed for drugs and biologics and other technologies. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jeter.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk to you about value reimbursement because I can't talk about reimbursement or clinical utility until we've established a coding system. And we all heard Reed this morning. He nailed it. We need a coding system that is very specific for the things that we're doing today. And I'm not going to make any personal comments on that. I'm just merely going to say that we, as a Medicare contractor, have undertaken a project the CMS has funded in Jurisdiction 1, which is California, Nevada, and Hawaii, to try to get a handle on coverage, coding, and reimbursement. I'm going to talk about the coding portion of that, and then maybe during the questions and answers we can specifically address any other issues that you may specifically have. But when it comes to coding, what we have, and I don't think the public here understands the coding system that is in existence, but it is a methodology-based system. In other words, if you extract DNA or RNA, there's a code. And if you do an enzyme treatment of that material, there's another code. And then there's a code if you use probes on it, or there are codes if you do a microarray. And you put all these stack of codes on the claim, but when the claim comes in the door, I don't know what you've done. It doesn't say that you've performed a KRAS or a BRAF or you've done Oncotype DX genomic testing or anything else. We have no idea what we're paying for. And these are all legitimate codes. And what we also know is there are lots and lots and lots of providers out there that are using legitimate codes and getting paid, but they're not doing the work and they're not doing that particular step as part of the process. So until we have a coding system, we're never going to be able to get a handle on what we're paying for, and nobody likes to say this, or the fraud that is going on in the provider community. So, okay, what is this project? This project is a requirement that all laboratories in J1 that are submitting any of the stacking codes, and it's a range of 13 codes, and it's 83890 for those of you that are coders up to the 83913, I think, or 4. And any claim coming in the door with that has to have a unique identifier that tells us as a contractor what the service is that has been rendered. So all labs submitting for a molecular diagnostic codes have got to obtain a unique identifier. And we've allowed 3 different ways that providers can in fact get an identifier. But effective May the 1st, any claim coming in the door without that identifier in the write-in field, which is, it's a narrative comment field, the claims aren't even going to come in the door. They are going to be rejected up front if we don't have this information. CMS is serious and Palmetto is serious that we have to know what we're paying for. Now, I'll go on further, and just because there are people in the audience who've heard me speak last week in California, and certainly CMS knows this because I've shared all this information with them. I'm going to use an example of KRAS. When I have taken the KRAS that have been already submitted to me or are available out in the public domain, I'm going to tell you that I have a spreadsheet with 12 different laboratories all doing KRAS. At the bottom end, the code stack brings in a reimbursement of $172. At the top end, it's $860. Why would any provider be paying all of this variety of different prices for the same thing? You're buying an analyte. You're buying a result. So that is the reason for the project. As we go forward, maybe other contractors will take this on. Maybe CMS will want this to, be a national thing. But certainly it's a way to get a handle on what we're paying for. Because right now, we are clueless in the molecular world what we're paying for. Now, let's talk next generation sequencing. There are no codes for that. I'm assuming, and I actually know, there are providers that are billing the Medicare program. There is no clinical utility yet that has been provided to us as a contractor to justify justify billing of the Medicare program. And yet I know through hard work on my part, that the claims are coming in the door. I can identify a few of them. I don't know all of them. Again, it's because we don't have a coding system that meets the needs of both the providers and the payers. And I've probably said too much.
No, that was very helpful. So I have a question that is lingering from the evidence panel. And someone in that panel said that the revenue may not justify generating the evidence. And I would be curious as to whether folks on the panel think that's true, whether that's a fact of life, and or whether there's a remedy.
I can comment that it's all too true, and it happens much too frequently. So if your standard is not to become a philanthropy, but to turn a return on investment for shareholders, then there's tremendous scientific and medical utility in reasoning to introduce a diagnostic. But when you look at the historic penetration curve and adoption rates for some of these compelling diagnostics and solid organ transplantation, and for example, just last week, tremendous science meeting all of the literature thresholds for analytical validity, clinical validity, and actually working out what this company could expect through various business approaches or business strategies. In 3/4 of all of their applications, they could not meet a return on investment for generating the further evidence they would need to either run the gauntlet for an FDA PMA process or to strike an international collaboration deal to generalize the evidence and introduce this product to the marketplace. So it's a significant dilemma.
If I can add to that, everybody wants to be the next Genomic Health. And one thing that Genomic Health had going for us, and I was with Genomic Health for the first 4 years of commercialization, was that we had incredibly savvy and patient investors. And they understood that these things take time and allowed us the leeway to do what we needed to do the right way. It's rare to see that patience and fortitude on behalf of investors these days. They want a quick bang for their buck.
I'll just add to that, Dr. Gutman, that in some cases it may be appropriate for technologies as they're developing the data, developing it with the payers, and the payers would be paying for the technology and collecting data at the same time, and that's worked in some cases and some technologies, and as a way to both have access to the product and expand the available evidence.
No comment.
Maybe I just want to comment on something Brian said, specifically about risk sharing. The last 3 or 4 weeks of my life had been consumed by the pharmaceutical industry that has entered risk sharing agreements overseas and how to escape those enterprises. And then I saw an editorial here in the Wall Street Journal recently saying that risk sharing ultimately in the United States is probably not a model that will fly. I think Medicare could embrace coverage with evidence development in a concerted way if the model was implemented differently than it had been in the past, because I think the examples are not all that rosy for companies that have entered into that regime. But I just wanted to highlight that solution for those that have experimented with it are now trying to escape it.
If I may just add a different nuance to risk sharing, and that is the patient piece. And especially as we work with younger companies, the head executives will tell you that if a doctor thinks the patient is going to get a bill, they'll stop using the test. And we do live in a very entitled philosophy right now as far as healthcare is concerned, and patients on the one hand really want these things, they want the information, but they are not prepared to pay for it, even with relatively minimal shares of cost.
So I wanted to come back to the word value. We heard a lot about reimbursement, and that was one of the areas of focus of the questions, the organizing questions. But when I think about value, I think about it from the perspective of cost and outcomes. And that the value of introducing something is measured by some relationship between cost and outcomes. And that if you have something that lowers costs and improves outcomes, that's a no-brainer. If you have something that increases cost and decreases outcomes, you want to keep that away. And then there are the tough ones where you say, well, there's an improvement in outcomes, but there's also an increase in cost. And does the increase in outcomes justify the increase in cost? An example like that might be Gleevec, where very expensive medication, but for a previously untreatable disorder, and people pay for that. And so I think it's all the problems that have been mentioned here reflect the fact that in our system, we really don't have any way to do that sort of an analysis. And everybody brings a different perspective to the table, but we all also have an ownership in trying to make that equation work to get to that upper left-hand corner of improving outcomes and decreasing cost. So I guess I would just like the panel's perspective on value from that view of life, as opposed to value from what can I expect from a reimbursement. Recognize that right now, clearly reimbursement is not tied to that type of value.
Maybe I'll try to, well, I think some of this revolves around a social compact about how we're going to reward value creation. And in a world of zero-sumness, oftentimes a disruption in care pathway creates value, which means that it has to be extracted by the entity that was consuming those costs. So having the discipline or having the arbiter to actually extract that money flow to an entity, to a provider, to enforce a decision, to actually create clinical guidelines that don't have all the squishy language that basically put all options on the table rather than constrain options around evidence. There's that lack of discipline. So ultimately, this becomes a game of opportunism. Of, okay, where is things going? What do the vectors look like? What are changes? Where does accountable care produce information imbalance? What can I learn first and capitalize on and manipulate the system? Ultimately, we're still around manipulating the system, around value and capturing it. The challenges also are around that value creation tends to be time delimited because everyone's gaming the system, so everyone's trying to fix or adapt to what Elaine had referred to as fraud, which is a heavy term. But ultimately, if we're gaming the system around capturing and sequestering value for ourselves rather than for the system, then we have the prisoner's dilemma, and everyone's going to be working against for their own self-interest, and that's not a sustainable healthcare system. But for businesses right now, that's the successful business model right now, is to work in that environment.
Well, I would just add to that, it's a great question, and one I think that the healthcare system is grappling with. If you look at the healthcare system, or most goods and services in the economy today, the payment rates are not set based on outcomes. You don't decide how much you want to pay for something after you buy it. You pay for it up front, and that's true with healthcare, and it's true for most other industries. So we're early on in this whole development of a new framework. There has to be a common methodology that payers and providers and companies are going to agree to, and it's very early stage. It's the examples we have where this is happening have really been driven by lack of coverage. So if there's a new technology and it's not going to get covered, there's been some flexibility, and people are going into risk-sharing arrangements or whatever you want to call them, collecting evidence or data. But otherwise, the system, pretty much pays for things based on what the value is set based in the market or the healthcare system.
Also, one of the biggest challenges that laboratorians have in getting really robust outcome data was alluded to in the previous panel, which was a test is ordered, we provide a result, but beyond that, we can't control what is done with the result. So was the test ordered appropriately? Was the information from the test used appropriately? Was it used at the proper time in the management protocol for that patient, or was it ordered when it was too late and nothing was going to make a difference? So for so many of those reasons, I think we would all dearly love to have good outcomes data, but it's such a challenge for us as the test developers and providers to be able to get it.
I'm going to bring a different perspective to this whole issue. You would think that the molecular test would be so specific that it would eliminate unnecessary testing. But at the current time, the majority of the claims that come into the system is just additive. It's additional cost, an additional economic burden to the whole process and everything. Part of this, I can give some examples, but if you were to have an assay that will identify, rare tumors, you are now dealing with a laboratory or laboratories that have great capacity to do this and excellence in providing a result. But the specimen is coming from a pathologist who has a vested interest in doing many, many immunohistochemistries because of our system of the more you do, the more you get paid. Instead of having a system that, and I am a pathologist, that if you don't know where you're going with the minimum of 7 immunohistochemistries, because with 7 you can cut it into all the different directions that you think you need to go, if at that point you haven't got clear direction, then it should be going on to a molecular assay. But what we see is the claims coming in the door, with 12, 15, 18, 25 immunohistochemistries, ka-chink, ka-chink, ka-chink. And then they finally give a differential diagnosis of, it's probably this, cannot rule out this. So what is the oncologist? And this is not because they're incompetent. Please don't get me wrong on this. It's because of the primitiveness of the neoplasm that they're dealing with. But there needs to be, in this whole educational process, and I heard education, education, education all today, there needs to be a process where even our highly trained people are educated that at a point, that's it. And maybe what we need to do is at a top of 7 immunohistochemistries, cut off the reimbursement to it. I mean that would be a little extreme, but it needs to be if we're going to go molecular and pay for molecular, it needs to be a release of other expenses in the system of less sensitive and specific assays. That's my 2 cents.
I just wonder if perhaps we don't need to be so general in the way we look at things. So, for example, you were talking about PMAs. PMAs are only about 6%, well, about 2% of the tests we see, not that many. And there are probably areas in where PMAs actually, the people who do PMAs actually end up earning money, or do you think they would? So HPV is one of them. I would guess that it's an area in which the companies are actually able to make money, because we had now, in the last 3 years, we had originally 1 HPV PMA. Now, in the last 3 years, 3 new ones have come in. And the data sets that we have seen in those have surprised even the FDA, where they actually had tens of thousands of data points, which is very unusual for diagnostics to see. So clearly there are areas where developing the test correctly, where actually getting good, solid data is useful, and can the test can be paid for later on. Otherwise, these companies will be going out of business.
Yeah, that's a good point. I will comment specifically on that one, where the analysts in Wall Street have already reflected on Roche's investment is probably, they've committed 3 times more capital than they'll ever return with that assay. So, again, business acumen here be damned. there's a regulatory approach and a submission and an investment that they'll never get a return on. If you're a single company and that's your only shot at commercial success, then that's obviously a failure. It's an absorption for Roche. But I don't want to say that PMA and regulatory processes is at fault here. There's perfectly good reasons why you would want to pursue that and create value with that type of regulatory approach.
So just want to comment on a couple of things. First, I want to echo what Dr. Jeter said. I'm actually from a diagnostic testing company, and we see the problems ourselves. So what you say is 200%. And the same thing's happening in other places too. For example, flow cytometry, I'm sure you know. So it's very difficult for us to compete when we see that other people are gaming the system. So just a couple of things. You said 3 types of codes. You're talking AMA, Z, and P codes?
In our project, we call them Z codes, PTI, or the third avenue for getting a claim in the door is to actually submit all the information that we require on the other 2 ways of getting a claim in the door, but to do it with the documentation submitted with each claim.
Oh, individual, at a claim level?
At a claim level, yes.
Okay. And going back to the cost plus versus the value-based system, this is probably for the entire panel. Is CMS looking into, or any of these entities that are payers, looking into going away from the cost plus system, which is what is holding us down today, and go more towards value system? Is that happening?
I heard a rumor that the innovation sector within CMS was entertaining that, but there was no formal program that I can see or refer to. But I think there's interest in those partnerships. It's challenging because of the exposure and the risk profile. And if you use the comparator as the imaging industry did and entered those processes and tried to define that value, ultimately they produced information transparency to the payers or to Medicare that actually harmed them as opposed to benefited them as an industry. So it cuts both ways here on how and what information is being shared and ultimately what the purpose and the utility of, at the end of the day, the one holding the purse is the winner.
And the only way that's really been available to us right now is to use an NOC, not otherwise classified, also called unlisted code, and then put a price, stake in the ground and fight for it virtually with every claim. But you have to have tremendous fortitude and a lot of resources, both human and dollar.
That'd be the same as the S codes, for example.
Right, but the S codes are being discontinued.
I realize that, of course.
Yeah, but yes, that's the concept.
Roger gets the last word, and I think we have to wrap up.
Okay, so, well, first of all, there is actually a code set, and it's published in the 2012 CPT book, a new code set, and there's a code for KRAS for colon cancer. There actually is more than one application for KRAS. One is colon cancer, anti-EGFR therapy in colon cancer. The other is inherited, so that I suppose it's possible because we have full gene sequencing and then we have codons 12 and 13. But anyway, getting back to value-based pricing, because this is do you feel that there's a potential risk? One obvious measure of value is, for example, not giving an expensive chemotherapeutic agent to patients. So do you feel that when we get into value-based pricing, do you feel that there's a potential risk that the evidence will be, that evidence of the value of a diagnostic test or its accuracy or its clinical predictiveness will be diminished for tests that reduce use of an expensive chemotherapeutic agent? For example, you do X test, you're classified in X way, you don't give the drug. That saves, for example, a payer money, but perhaps the underlying evidence, just like the weatherman who has 40% predictiveness but 10% that we know what we're talking about, perhaps the underlying evidence will be less closely analyzed in settings that, quote, increase value or decrease costs to payers.
In my experience, the payers have always hinged their decision on the medical utility as opposed to the economics. And I've been involved with multiple companies that have produced economic evidence and models and clinical studies to justify the economics of their value creation, and it's gone over the heads of the payers. Both the content, nor were they really interested. It ended up being a check. Oh, you have an economics paper? Boom. Check. And so it's less around this economic savings that are driving public and private payers in my experience.
Right, but if there's an emphasis on value.
Well, I think this new value phenomenon is probably not a payer, but it is the ACOs and the consolidation of hospitals is the new paradigm of this, I think, perversion of value and how it gets implemented in those settings.
So that would be a capitated system.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that payers are somewhat dismissive of economic stories, especially early on in the conversation, is that, you know, typically I'll start to talk to a company and the first words out of their mouth, the payers are going to love this. It's going to save them millions. But payers aren't in the business of theory. They're in the business of fact. So they want to see not that a test could potentially save all these dollars. They don't want to look at it until you can show that their physician providers really did use this test appropriately, made decisions based on the results of these tests, and that's where if the potential dollar savings, if there are any, come from. It's not theory, it has to be fact.
Okay, I want to thank the panel, thank the audience. I did indicate to the panel that once we resolve this, we would start working on peace in the Middle East.